So my name is Erwin van Veen. I work at the Conflict Research Unit at Clingendael. I usually run a small team that focuses on conflict and political crisis in the Middle East. But due to some past work, I occasionally dip a toe in matters around security sector governance and development. And that led to this seminar. The immediate trigger is the UNSG report of this year on security sector reform and the efforts around that to revive some of the SSR agenda. So for that purpose, we've brought together a number of speakers that will provide us with sort of a buffet of inputs, if you like. I will very briefly introduce them, including why I am certain that they will make a very useful contribution to this debate at this time. We have to begin with Christina Cheng, who published widely on the peacebuilding and state building agenda in which much SSR work is situated. And we really need to understand how that agenda is evolving in order to correctly assess the problems and challenges, but also the opportunities for SSR work today. I would be remiss not to mention also her work on elite bargains and reducing violent conflict of 2018 for the stabilization unit. That is important in the context of the discussion here and now. Alex Berg just published a very good book on governing security after war. I will show it to you on the screen. It's a recommended reading. I haven't fully gone through it, but he really tackles a few questions head on that we need to hear about today. And then last but not least, Waldemar Vrey, who apart from being the Deputy Special Representative at the time in Liberia for the UN mission, also led the UN independent review team that took a hard look at how UN missions undertake their SSR work these days. It's not a pretty picture, but there are good entry points for improvements that we wanted to put on the table in this session. So more fundamentally, why are we having this session? I mean, it is basically simply put because the quality of security institutions matters. It matters for the prospects of political crisis, violence, and conflict. And therefore, it matters to the prospects for development. And that ties us in with the whole conflict prevention agenda, but also the SDG agenda and the whole question of post-war reconstruction. So that issue of how do you increase the quality of security institutions has been with us for some time. There still isn't really much of an answer in terms of how do you do it, right? And can external support even have any influence on this equation? What are really the drivers that enable or disable change? So we're trying to sort of take a step at that in this conversation. And I have invited each of our speakers to begin with a short 10-minute pitch along the following lines. Christina will help us sort of to get a handle, if you like, on the broader geopolitical challenges and opportunities for international security sector support in the context of the peace and state building agendas as they develop, if they still exist, which you could argue might not be the case. Then Alex will really try to get at the question sort of when and why do national or local elites actually agree to reform, right? Since this is often not in their interests and they face a very difficult trade-off in many cases between self-preservation and the pursuit of self-interests and the more, sort of neutral and oversight demands that better security governance might require. And then finally, from Wally, we will hear about how can UN missions actually up their game if it comes to their SSR work. An easy question, but there are no easy answers, but we will learn more about it soon. So a few practical points to conclude with as far as the introduction goes. We're live, so this is being recorded, so we're not under Chatama's rules. Might be useful to keep that in mind depending on what you want to say. After the interventions, we'll shift over to Q&A. And for that, I would simply invite you to raise your hand, at the bottom of the screen. And then I will give you the floor at some point to pose your question. And depending on what it is, we'll turn to one or several of the speakers, or maybe even participants, since we have a very rich and varied group attending this meeting. So thanks very much again for joining this session. I hope it's gonna generate some good input for all of us, food for thought. And without further ado, Christine, could I hand over to you?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Erwin, and to Clingendael, and to Alex and Wally for organizing all of this and for asking me to participate in it. So I'm very keen to get into this conversation again, because I feel like the context has changed so much, and it is time to re-examine some of our ideas. So this is quite perfect in terms of timing. I've been asked to talk about changes in global geopolitics and the trends and the impact on security sector reform more broadly. But before I do that, I think it's actually important for us just to think about some terms and where we want to go with this conversation. So I think the first thing, that when Erwin and Alex were setting out the agenda and they sent us some notes, the intention here that they posed was to ask about the requirements. What requirements would successful international security sector reform support meet, right? So what is being asked of us here today? Where do we want to get to in the end? And I think part of what we need to think about here are two things. What do we actually want in the end? What is the aim of security sector reform trying to achieve, right? What's the end goal here? And I think that's really important, because we have different end goals, and different institutions, different countries, different ministries and politicians have very different end goals. And the first trick is actually to figure out what you think your at least minimum common end goal might be. And I would say a lot of the time it's just to bring a pretty stable end to war, what we would call a sustainable peace, right? Or at least a dramatic reduction in violence, and hopefully, a more or less an elimination to that kind of large competitive kind of violence. But the thing is, there's also a lot more that I think is hidden within the term, security sector reform, and there's more hidden within what we want out of stabilization and the end of war, right? So that, I think, though, is much more difficult, and we might have a much more expansive idea of what we want at the end of this that goes far beyond the ability, like just the simple elimination of violence. And I think that discussion often needs to be had internal to countries, internal to military institutions, internal to a whole set of actors. But the problem is nobody wants to be honest about those end goals, right? So we say we want democratization, we say we want gender equality, we say we want human rights, we say we want a whole lot of things. But I think mostly what a lot of the actors in this space really want is for this country to stop being a problem. And that sounds rather blunt, but I think at a minimum, there is a floor, and it's important to talk about what the floor is. And it's also important to talk about where it goes beyond that. And then the second thing, just about setting the terms, is what is SSR, right? We all have different conceptions of SSR. It can be quite broad and expansive to include everything from rule of law and judicial reform, down to the kind of nuts and bolts of dealing with introducing human rights into reform and learning into the military or the police. It can involve, all sorts of things that some folks might include in their definition of SSR and others absolutely would not. The other thing to flag, I think, for some folks in the room, and this is something that only really came to me about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, that SSR is really very much a Westernized term, and really more of a European term, which I hadn't fully appreciated, that especially folks in the military, they don't really think in SSR terms. It's really, this is a space for people who do peace building, peacekeeping, conflict transformation. But the folks on the defense side don't really talk about SSR in the same way. And if they do talk about some of the substantive things that we're doing, they use different language for it. And so there is a conversation to be had about that language as well. So even just defining what that space of SSR is important. Okay, now I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of what I was asked to do. And that is just to think about, what does this agenda look like? And so Erwin and Alex laid out some concerns that they had about where things are going. And I think they're exactly right. And they have been building for a while, right? So, and I think Erwin hinted at this in his opening remarks, is there still an agenda? Is there still a space for us to act? I hope the answer to that is yes. But having said that, I think there is broadly a decline in this space, and you can see it just in the number of peacekeeping operations and peace operations that are really active around the world, right? So this is not the same space that it was 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago. And it feels like the space is closing down rather than opening up. So the question then, I think, to ask is why? And that's what I'll try and talk about today. And I'll talk about sort of one way of thinking about where the trends are going and why they're going the way they're going. And also that I don't see a reversal in that, except for a little bit of hope, if I can cast it that way, at the end of the talk. So I want to talk about the kind of framings here first. And then the second bit where I think there might be hope is in the role of NATO and the rejuvenation of NATO and where that might fit for the SSR space. So a bit of not so great news, and then maybe we'll see where things go depending. So the first, I think, there are a set of three big shifts, and you can think about them as moving together, and they're really different ways of framing the same sets of things that are happening. But I think that sets the tone for why we are broadly where we are. And this is most recently, I think, the kind of terrorism agenda has really shaped a lot of that, and it got us to the place where, in part, we are now. But the space we are now is, there's a big discussion around, the democratization versus authoritarianism / populism split, right, in the world. And a different way of thinking about that really is thinking about great power competition, right? It's the same set of actors on both sides of those coins, but it's a different way of framing the problem. And they speak to the same dynamics, but they lead us, I think, to slightly different analyses of how to deal with it. And also at the same time that all of this is going on is globalization and deglobalization. And I think all of those things actually have very profound effects on how we talk about and think about SSR. So when I was saying earlier about the fact that SSR is really more of a space for those who really, have been working in the war to peace transition space, I think that's the fact that we've got now these battle lines drawn around the democratization versus authoritarianism space kind of sets the tone for where the SSR space can go, right? So, and that's why I was talking about the framing of our language. So you might be trying to achieve the same things, but you're using different language. If you use a language that is more about doing the task and the functionality, rather than talking about democratic transformation and human rights controls over the military, right, which is much more of a democratization agenda, then you will attract or repel different audiences and different countries and different institutions within this space, right? So I think the language here really matters, and depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve, that we are collectively trying to achieve, it may be useful to pivot with that language. So I would think about sort of those broader trends as setting the tone for what can happen within this space. And I think if the end goal is to get to a massive reduction in violence, especially the violence that's perpetrated by the state security sector, then maybe the shift in language is actually going to help us get to our goal faster than pushing for SSR kind of language, even though we're trying to achieve the same thing. And I'm a bit ambivalent about this, because I do like the fact that the SSR agenda comes with a whole set of other transformative tools that give rights to citizens, right? And allow them to claim those rights, I think, in a much more deliberate way. But I'm also a bit wary of, well, it turns off a lot of people as well. And just, again, the whole framing around great powers, you know, with the China-US divide on these issues, I think will also, these are things that also have to be kept in mind in terms of who wins and who loses. And even though there isn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be framed that way, that might be the way it ends up being framing. And the whole thing around globalization, deglobalization will have massive impacts around supply chains in particular, and procurement, and all of that affects the SSR agenda and training. So, you know, all of those things are all of a piece, but they fall along these kind of polarizing lines. So the bit of hope that I have is maybe around NATO here for the SSR space. And I think, and we can see this with, if we're thinking about what comes out of Ukraine and what comes later, and also the kind of new participation of Sweden, Finland, you know, that changes the scope of what might be possible, and also creates a potential model for what new versions of this might look like, deeper cooperation, and also how to do it well, right? So I think these are all things and spaces where NATO can actually lead by example. And I think that bit of space might be very hopeful for learning, you know, global North and global South kind of learning there could take place. So I think that's the bit of good news that I'd like to add to the conversation. But the other bits, I'm a little bit less hopeful about. I'll pass the floor on.
Thank you, Christina. I think you just managed to put a really interesting challenge, maybe in a sense, on the table, right? In the sense that if you reflect on the question, what can happen in that space, i.e., the space that is sort of labeled as under the term SSR, with its sort of Western or even European pedigree, and you say it probably a bit less transformational, more state-focused, less normative, you know, things like this. That's a very interesting starting point, I think. So we can hopefully elaborate a bit more in the discussion on what exactly that would mean, right? So which parts of the agenda or the range of activities that are commonly associated with security sector governance or security sector reform would then need to be downplayed, right? Or put on the back burner.
Let me clarify, I want to be normative and I want to be transformative, but I just think that the reality of the situation makes it very difficult to do so. So don't get me wrong, I'm not, I dream of things that I don't always think are possible.
No, that's totally understood. And on the record, I didn't want to make you sound different. I just think it's a good confrontation, I think, with reality to put these things in slightly stark terms. So I appreciate you doing that in a very nuanced and sophisticated way. So good, excellent. So that there we have our first sort of issue set for discussion, I think. Maybe we then flip over to Alex, who is going to hopefully take us through some of his thinking on, you know, why on Earth's name would elites actually agree to anything that sounds like security sector governance, improvement, reform, development, given that these are essential tools to hold on to power, to protect themselves and their own interests. Alex, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Erwin, and thank you to the Clingendael Institute for organizing the session. I'm very, very excited to be sharing with this group, and thanks, Christine, for those remarks. I think what I'm going to do is go from the kind of broad context that Christine said and really zoom in to the context on the ground in many of these situations. So I spent many years working and more recently doing research on how these efforts play out on the ground. And so what I want to do is share some of those insights from the book. And to do that, I want to just set the scene for a moment. And if you would, just kind of imagine, if you will, that you have been assigned to go work on a security sector reform program in a given country. You can choose to pick the country. And you arrive on the grounds and you're kind of managing this project. And of course, one of your first stops is to go visit the Minister of Justice, who oversees the police and law enforcement, which is one of the groups that you're working with. And you're sitting in the waiting room, waiting for a meeting. And you just see the waiting room is full of people and different groups of people kind of coming in and out of the minister's office. And finally, the minister lets you in and apologizes for the long delay in meeting with you. And he goes on, he says, I'm very sorry, but it's been a really busy day. We've got one person, who wants help with a criminal case. Another person wants, somebody appointed to a position. Other people want jobs. The president wants me to appoint this group from the police. A powerful politician wants me to appoint that other group. And, then we've got, your delegation, and there's a Chinese delegation and a, Dutch delegation waiting, after you. Of course, the minister is probably not going to share all these things with you, but that's probably what's going on. What he's really going to do is just say, okay, now how can I help? How can I help you? So I just kind of convey this anecdote, and this is, I think, reflects some of my experience and maybe some of yours, to convey what I would call the day-to-day politics of working in these environments, right? What I might sometimes call small p politics, just the constant pressure on public officials in any country, and especially in developing and conflict-affected countries, on the security sector. And of course, these small p politics, these kind of day-to-day politics, are embedded in what I would call big P politics, right? The struggles over competition, the competition over authority, both within a country and as Christine highlighted, internationally as well. And I think that's I think it's important to kind of think about how these trends are reflected in changes in the international context, right? So we might think of recent cases, right? So we might think of the case of Ukraine, right? Where a couple of years ago, President Waldemar Zelensky comes into office, a former actor without connections to all these networks. And the question is, and kind of global competition playing out, the question is, does this make it easier or harder to undertake important reforms in the defense sector that need to happen? We can think of the case of Libya, right, where you've got numerous different factions and external actors, and what kind of settlement, what kind of, why would there be decisions to undertake reforms that would lead to more professional police forces or defense forces that cut across all these different factional interests, right? So these are the kinds of questions that I tackle in my research that are in my book. And so what I want to do just briefly in the next few minutes is talk about how these kind of big P and small p politics interact. What do I mean by politics in the security sector, why it matters, and how we might think about it as international actors. So first of all, what do I mean by politics? We all know, right? The security sector is political. Well, what does that mean? So we still, I think, often like to think of the security sector, of security forces in terms, right, the ideal type that was laid out by Max Weber, right, the sociologist, right? The security sector is about the legitimate monopoly on legitimate use of force. That's about serving the public according to rational rules and procedures, right? But as we all know, and for most of human history and in most of the world, right, the security sector and security forces are really about serving the interests of the powerful, right? And in many countries, controlling and using the security forces is really central to how you achieve power and how you stay in power if you're a political actor. And this plays out in the processes through which security forces are managed, right? What we often call security sector governance. And so in my book, I highlight kind of three areas in which we see this play out really clearly, right? So one is personnel issues, right? Who gets appointed, how people get recruited. Is it done through merit-based appointments and promotion procedures like we like to see, or is it done through appointing people because they're part of a favored group, right? So ethnic stacking or sectarian stacking, right? Using a favored group makes a lot of sense, both because you're assured that the security forces remain loyal, also because then you can use those security forces to go out and punish your political opponents, right? And make sure you get the right outcome in the election, right? So think of, for example, security forces in Iraq after 2003, which were really, many of which are really about sectarian-based targeting and repression, right? So personnel is crucial here. Another area is oversight, right, and administrative procedures. right? Whether budgets, public financial management procedures are transparent, subject to oversight, right? What we promote as an SSR agenda, right? Whereas the lack of transparency enables all kinds of really useful practices like sole source contracting and kickback schemes, right? Which are often a crucial way to get resources out to political supporters, right? And this is maintaining these is really important, right? If you're a politician. Then there's a third area of accountability, right? Whether personnel are held accountable for abuse and corruption, or if you're security force personnel and you're trying to work on behalf of the regime, you want to be sure that you're not going to be held accountable when you're acting on behalf of the regime. And, for example, my colleague Moses Kisa has some really good research on Uganda and how the Ugandan regime has manipulated accountability processes to go after regime opponents and protect loyalists and supporters, right? And this is sort of how accountability processes work, right? So to understand this kind of political logic really requires getting into the nitty-gritty details of how these functions work. But it's also understanding the context, right? What are the political struggles? How are the coalitions set up? What are the resources and networks by which coalitions are built? And how do the security forces fit into that, right? So I think it's really, as part of the SSR agenda, crucial to understand that. Why is it important to understand that? Well, first, because it helps us understand, one, why there's opposition, but also where openings are, right? And here's a crucial sort of insight or finding from my research is that these interests are never homogeneous, right? They're within a country. There are those who benefit from the status quo. There are also those who lose from the status quo. There are winners and losers, right? There are always winners and losers, right? So for example, one of the findings in my book is that actors who have kind of more fragmented coalitions or who have threats from within the security forces, oftentimes SSR reforms are beneficial, right, politically. So I look at the case of Liberia, for example, where the Johnson Sirleaf administration really benefited from defense reforms after 2003 because it reined in a longstanding threat to the regime, right? So it's beneficial there politically. So it's important to kind of understand these different political interests in terms and understand the political openings. The second reason it's important to understand it because it sheds light on the role of international actors, right? So external actors are part of this political environment, right? They always have been. And it's even more important now that we understand the various international interests and agendas at play in the security sector. So through aid and political backing and what seems to be technical assistance training, right, supports certain actors and interests and also marginalizes or excludes others. And astute aid can really use that in a way that helps support reforms, right? So in Liberia, donor aid ended up supporting people who benefited from reform, and that helped made things possible. By contrast, in Iraq, right, it seems that external support after 2003 benefited a political party that drew its power on a much more exclusive network, right, and had no interest in the kinds of reforms that would lead to more professional interest, right? So it's crucial to understand how international aid is interacting with these interests within a country, right? So SSR, right, as we all know, SSR may be technical, but it is almost always also political, right? So once we understand that these kinds of dynamics are happening, what can we do about it? So the first point, and I just want to highlight a couple of points, and this is kind of also in the conclusion of my book, but and hopefully this will spark a little bit of discussion. So the first point is really to understand these dynamics, right? So we talk a lot about political economy analysis, right, as a tool to do this. Political economy analysis is a tool that's used quite increasingly in development, but much less often in the security sector. But it's important. What is it? What do we mean by political economy analysis? Well, it's kind of what I do. It's understanding who the main actors are, what their interests are, what their resources and networks are, and understanding how those play out within the nitty-gritty of procurement, personnel, financing, as I discussed, right? And so this can be done often, as an analysis, as a study. But I think what we found in practice is that much better than a one-off study this is sort of part of the process of programming, right? As an ongoing process, right? tracking and monitoring how these interests are evolving, how they're changing, and how international assistance is interacting with it, right? So the best kind of PA is really as a consistent component in a project so that we can understand these dynamics. A second thing that we should think about is how to direct or how to use international resources in ways that lead to the kinds of changes, institutional changes that we're interested in and that our partners and countries are interested in, right? I kind of outline a few ways to do that, right? One is directing resources towards supporters, making sure that the people who really benefit from reforms are being promoted, are getting access to training opportunities, right? This is what's happening anyway, and external resources are either contributing to making sure that supporters are getting resources or not. There are ways to use things like vetting and severance to also weaken people internally who are opposed to these kinds of institutional changes. There's a lot about sharing information, right? Information is really kind of tricky in these contexts, but there's a lot of great examples of using information and information sharing strategically to support the kinds of reforms. There's the use of leverage more effectively, right? Leverage that's targeted to understanding, again, what the networks and resources are within a country and within a political coalition, and using leverage effectively in a way that's actually targeting the interests of domestic actors. And again, that requires engaging with the context. So I have a lot of examples of this that I'm happy to discuss further. But the last point I just want to emphasize, and this was actually one of the, I think, more surprising findings from my research, is the importance of relationships. And it was surprising to me all of the times in talking to people who've been involved in these SSR processes, how often they talked about relationships and trust between certain individuals. And this makes sense, right? If you think about the kinds of institutional changes that we're talking about being extremely difficult politically, being extremely risky, right? If you're kind of putting your political capital on the line, right? And so you want to know that those who are kind of asking and supporting these changes are there, and they're going to keep supporting you in the long term. And this has been a huge problem, I think, in SSR, in the ability of donors, international actors to kind of build those relationships, build that trust, and also maintain that commitment over time. So, we could come back to the Ukraine case, right? For example, where one of the really, I think, interesting and hidden dimensions of the current conflict are a whole set of institutional changes that happened in the years prior to the current war, which was about transforming procurement systems, military industry, right? Really kind of boring SSR topics, but that I would argue have been critical to the performance of the Ukrainian defense sector. And were possible due to the kind of internal political context as well as the external, but also external support. So these kinds of relationships between domestic actors, international actors are crucial. And they're crucial, especially now as we're sitting in the United States. Really what we're focusing on is some of the trends that Christine outlined in terms of global competition, in terms of competing paradigms and competing norms, right? Developing these kinds of relationships and trust are especially important. So that's what I'll end, and hopefully have get into some more of this in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Alex. So that basically brings us to a point where, on the one hand, we have sort of the decreasing or diminishing space or global space, as Christine outlined it, for SSR work, thinking, conceptualization, language, due to the sort of geopolitical competition and the nature of it at the moment. And you just gave us, I think, a few variables basically to assess sort of what the local scope for change might be, right? Based on the level of network cohesion. We can explore that a bit further in the discussion maybe. But also the level of resource availability, right? I think is a point that comes out clearly in your book. So these are two very useful variables that we could use that, assuming that there is space at some point at the global level for a particular kind of intervention, type of support, etc., then that's only a necessary but not a sufficient condition, right? A sufficient condition then has to be based on the kind of analysis that you've just put forward, which is really not often done, right? I think we can count the number of, let's say, UN missions or SSR program interventions probably on one hand that have ingrained political economy analysis and that kind of thinking in their program on a sustained basis. So thank you for that. And that's also a neat bridge to the question, so what about UN missions as one of the global tools to intervene locally, right? So that kind of brings together these different worlds of sort of global space for SSR and then local space for SSR, and tries to navigate that complexity, often being hamstrung by it in different ways, which we shall hear from Wally in a minute. So as we enter Wally's contribution, I would invite those of you who already have questions at the back of your mind just to put up your hand, and we can smoothly move into the Q&A afterwards. Wally, can I hand over to you, please? You're still muted, Wally.
There we go. I think that should be better. Well, good afternoon, Erwin. Thank you very much to you and Clingendael for putting this together, and to my two esteemed colleagues who certainly gave us a lot of points to think about, and I think that would lead to good discussions. So this is an opportunity to share some views on how the UN may be more successful in its SSR efforts, but let's also agree from the start that the UN is not an organization independent of the member states. It's in fact we the people who are putting all of our intellectual capacity together, in which we all have a voice, not only to be heard, but an expectation that we will do things together for the sake of peace and prosperity for all. So let's think of the UN as all of us together. So SSR work is firstly political in nature. We've heard that a number of times. It is sensitive and not easy to achieve, whether in a UN mission or whether in a bilateral support program. It takes a deliberate and a specific effort to make an impact that will have a long-term positive effect. An important success factor for the United Nations in creating a conducive environment for sustained peace and the promise of development thus depends on whether the UN peace operations are effective in fulfilling their Security Council mandate to support the national authorities in making security institutions more people-centered, more effective, and more accountable. In such context, SSR is the effort to change the capabilities, organizational cultures, and institutional frameworks that govern the security and justice sectors so that the organizations with the powers to coerce do indeed provide security instead of insecurity in a legitimate manner. The reality in countries moving out of conflict is that security and justice institutions are in disarray. They are politicized, they are corrupt, and or violent. They are the diametric opposite of what is needed. While this is most unfortunate, it is also not surprising. From an SSR perspective, it means that pragmatism, patience, coherence, and context must be the leading factors in shaping international support for security sector work. SSR is a critical area of support for United Nations peace operations. It is therefore of concern that the impressive development of SSR policy at the UN that has been carried out over the past 15 years has not necessarily shaped interventions in the field in a decisive way. And we try to identify a few reasons for this. We feel that there is limited awareness on the extent of SSR by many of the UN leaders, sometimes also due to political difficulty and sensitivity that are experienced in missions. Bold senior UN mission leadership should not shy away from creating discomfort by putting difficult SSR issues on the table. Therein lies the art to manage tension, productively resolve the matter, and to move forward jointly on a joint solution. The absence of dynamic integrated mission strategies on SSR that mobilizes levelers such as good officers or troop presences behind context-based SSR objectives. We may talk about context-based a little bit later in the discussion. A poor coordination between different mission units relevant to SSR, such as political affairs, human rights, gender equality, and rule of law teams, and of course, the United Nations country team. The dominance of an overly militarized focus in SSR, limited financial resources, poor political economy analysis of the national security sector and its possibilities for reform within local context, and then an almost non-existent ability to learn from past SSR experiences across the system. So what could we then effectively expect, and what should these reforms perhaps look like? Certainly, the recent Secretary General's report on SSR goes a long way to address many of these issues. Implementation challenges at mission level, however, still exist. The strategic challenge is how to translate all of the policy design into country-specific implementation guidance for mission leaders and experts. And some ideas that could be shared is to ensure that SSR aspects of mission mandates benefit from context-specific inputs and formulate clear benchmarks for SSR progress by the host government and mission mandates. This can be achieved through strategic dialogue with host countries at the highest political levels regarding the quality of their engagement with the Council and with the missions in country. We have to invest more in senior leaders by providing better support to them to deliver on SSR mandated tasks by considering executive coaching on SSR. In addition, expert capacity on call through creating an efficient and quick responding standby network to provide SSR expertise at opportune moments will support mission leadership. We also have to support and develop standardized analytical and learning capabilities across missions that will benefit future operations and member states in their bilateral considerations. The nature of SSR requires that missions have to follow an integrated SSR approach, including the UN country team from the onset, that will ensure a continuance of focus well beyond the life cycle of missions. No existing UN Secretariat structure at HQ level exists to oversee such an integrated one UN approach. And therefore, we have to consider putting in place such senior strategic oversight of UN SSR work, both in the field and at headquarters. We should consider developing actionable and context-based SSR implementation guidance for missions. The guidance should be short and actionable and should differentiate between different local contexts in which SSR has to take shape. And I'm happy to say that according to my knowledge and understanding, these efforts are underway. Increased resources available for SSR is important, traditionally through mission programmatic funding for SSR, but tailoring a global multi-partner trust fund and or global focal point trust fund to provide a collective UN support facility for missions is essential. Strengthening the partnership with the World Bank is also very important, not for the sake of fundraising, but to ensure that all of government or public sector approach of the host government to SSR initiatives are also applied throughout the government. Regrettably, an important concern is that member states are sometimes not helpful. And I say this with respect because I understand that everybody has good intentions. Many would continue to follow their own national interest when supporting SSR efforts, regardless of decisions that have been taken at the Council or the General Assembly levels. It is an impossible task for missions to comply with its mandate when obstructed in its work by independent bilateral support programs. There is a huge and important space for additional bilateral SSR support, but one would have hoped that collaboration and coordination between missions and bilateral programs could be much more effective. It is therefore an opportune moment to consider a targeted and a large-scale UN SSR business improvement initiative in collaboration with all the member states. It ought to center on a highly practical effort that enables missions to deliver better SSR work by upskilling their senior leadership on SSR and by upgrading their organization, resources, and implementation of SSR in close collaboration with supporting partners. Failure to do so will diminish the extent to which the UN can help create the minimum level of security required to anchor an often fragile peace and open new pathways for development. I honestly believe that we really have to invest in the United Nations as a joint effort between all of us to strengthen this and to be ready and better at what we do in the field. Thank you very much, Erwin.
Thanks so much, Wally. That was really a very comprehensive way of talking about sort of the many problems at different levels that UN missions face when trying to execute meaningful SSR work, right? Many of them outside of their own scope of control and many within. So that's it's always a useful distinction to make. So, you know, it's always easier to flag issues than to solve them. So I'm glad that we have a few colleagues from New York on this call, and I would definitely invite you to, you know, just raise your hand in case you want to bring anybody up to speed on the progress that you've been making through the UNSG report and other efforts. So that's just an open invitation. So that's great, Wally. That concludes basically our tour among sort of these different pieces of input that we had lined up. I have a few questions of my own, but let's turn to Owen first, who I see in the sidebar. So the way this will work is that I will ask my colleague who's behind this scene, so to speak, to unmute you so that you can speak and pose your question, and then I will turn to some of the panelists, depending on the question, to provide some initial answers. Owen, please go right ahead. Thanks for joining.
Well, thanks very much. Nice to see you, Owen. Sorry, I got to change. I can't turn my camera on. It looks. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be part of this, you know, event, and thanks very much for the three speakers. Two observations and then a question. A big question though. Clearly, I certainly agree with the political economy approach. I mean, analyzing interests, basically. I just want to add, I guess, an obvious point, and that's that although this is tricky, this is critical for SSR, it's actually critical for the whole peace building process in practice. And so one of the challenges, I think, is not only that quite often overall peace building strategies don't take deeply enough into account the realities of political bargains, political elite bargains, political settlements, but also the sort of thinking in designing the SSR is often, in my observation, a little divorced from the internal analysis of real interest-based policy when it comes to the wider task of peace building. Secondly, I certainly agree that we need to frame SSR so that it doesn't become symbolic of the, you know, authoritarian democratization, wider geostrategic debates. So I'm very happy to be pragmatic about that. My question is, so far, all of the panel have really focused quite a lot on SSR in the immediate aftermath of war. Just as the Civil War is ending, and that's quite logical and it's perfectly justified. But I wonder whether you could make some connections with, you know, SSR in fragile contexts or in contexts where the war, it is post-war, but the war ended, you know, some years ago. Obviously here, the challenge is you've got much more scope for studying the situation and then looking seriously at what the interests of those elites that are inviting SSR are and how to empower them. But there's obviously quite a sort of transition. I can well remember being an advisor on the Cambodia transition a long, long time ago, where 5 years after the war, a lot of international actors were pretending this wasn't a post-war context, it was normal developmental. And there's often this transitional issue. So I just wonder whether you can fill in the extent to which what you're saying also applies if we're talking about, you know, Sierra Leone and Liberia now, or contexts in Eastern Europe, in other developing countries where it may not be that they're recovering from a civil war, but they've got all sorts of challenges to do with fragility and citizen insecurity. So so I'm just inviting people to sort of see how much their message would change in that context. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Owen. And so let's do a quick tour along the panel. I saw Christina nodding confirmatively, so I'm sure she's got something to say. I think Alex's case studies in part speak to this question. And Wally, I'm sure, can speak from his own personal experience in Liberia, if nothing else. So let's do that quick tour. Let's say, you know, 1 or 2 minutes each, if you could be so kind, and then maybe we can pick up on the specific point of political economy analysis after that, because that's also useful to be broken down a little bit more. And then we'll turn to some of the other people who have raised their hand. Christine, over to you.
Yes, always to political economy analysis. I'm cheering that on. And then specifically to this question about pragmatism in the long term. And absolutely, I could not agree with you more on that point, Owen. I think there are huge opportunities there in the long run that, especially where the demand for change comes from within, right? I think we really talk about SSR as something that is externally driven by international/external actors, but it really can come from inside a country as well. And we can think about how unsuccessfully it went in Sudan, for example, right? Where the military was really very much at the heart of the crisis, but the demand was for change within that institution, but the space for that change was created by the people themselves. And so I think we shouldn't forget that aspect of where SSR can go and how it can come about, and also the interaction between the population and the demand, and then the coordination with the international community in taking advantage of that moment, and then leveraging that, and then creating the space, and the back and forth political negotiation that creates that's created amongst all of those actors together, right? So that dynamic in particular, I think, lots of potential for change here, and absolutely, if you don't get the change in SSR, then, and Alex spoke about this both obviously in his book, but also if you go and look at the report that Wally was leading, there is a lovely table. I think I can't see which page it's on, but there's the incentives of critical actors, right? And that really goes through point by point what we should be thinking about in that political economy analysis. And just even going through that checklist really helps you understand how the long-term dynamic ends up the way that it does. I mean, I wrote about this, I would say, I think it was, 15 years ago, in a book that we did on peace building and corruption. And the dynamic there is really one of trying to satisfy things in the short term, but giving up a lot of your long-term gains because you're not willing to make those challenges, as Wally was saying, and as Alex was pointing out, at the uncomfortable moment when you have the opportunity to do so, because it's just easier not to, right? And you're worried about pushing the country back into war, so you pull back from a lot of the kind of slight ratcheting or leveraging ability that you have in that moment. And then what ends up happening is you set the course for a kind of corruption equilibrium, a new, or maybe a return back to, or a maintenance of the existing corruption equilibrium that existed. And so I would say all of those things that you pointed out are absolutely the case. And there is huge potential for that kind of change and transformation. And I think actually individual militarily active countries like the US, like the UK, through all sorts of, bilateral training and education opportunities, there are all sorts of ways to change and incentivize that doesn't look like the kind of SSR that we might be talking about in war to peace transition times.
That's very perceptive, Christine. So basically to focus our attention on the fact that the ability to critique, reform, develop from within grows as the conflict recedes, right? Sort of, and civil society capabilities and perhaps military professionalism sort of increase, from the inside, and that offers pathways to channel international support more, shall we say, indirectly, right? Than these immediate post-war in-your-face kind of semi-SSR, semi-train and equip kind of interventions. Thank you. Alex, from your case studies, are there any particular findings that speak to Owen's question?
Yeah, to speak to this question about sort of non-post-war context and fragility context. One of the things that I look at actually is what is it about post-war contexts that make them different, and it's that often in post-war contexts are a period of political transition, right, where you have specific types of openings that come up, often as a result of new groups coming into power, right? So there's a peace agreement or an election, and then you've got a new party in power, or power sharing arrangement or something, and that creates new opportunities for institutional change, because the people who sort of were the networks that linked the the executive branch, right, the president, the ruling party, to the security forces, right, that party may no longer be in power. And so the new party that comes into power has a very different set of interests and might be more open to changes that actually, may increase transparency, right? And you get those kinds of openings often in post-war transitions, but they don't only happen in post-war transitions, right? So the question really in looking beyond post-war transitions is what kind of openings are there and where do they happen, right? So you may have a change in political party in a fragile context where a new party comes into power, and some of those same dynamics occur in which the new incumbent party, has an interest in actually gaining greater control over the security forces because they are not part of the same networks, right? They don't have the same networks that the previous party had. There's a potential opening. And you also might have the opposite, right? Where you're kind of in the sort of one party or that's been in control for a long time and really has very little incentive or strong incentive to oppose. So the question in these fragile contexts is doing that analysis, right? What the different parties are, what their interests are, how their networks are connected to the security forces that you're interested in affecting. And that analysis can be done. One of the things that it requires looking both kind of within the security forces and also more broadly to actors outside perhaps of the regime, right? So looking at kind of the political context. I mentioned Uganda earlier. There's some really interesting analysis of, right, the regime in Uganda has been in power for a long time, right? And outside donors, the United States in particular, has been very wary of kind of not supporting that regime because of its security interests, right? Whereas there is an opposition, and that opposition has been systematically weakened, right? And that really closes off any kind of avenues for potential reform that you want to see there, right? Somebody mentioned in the chat, there's a question about Mali. Again, right? There's sort of the political interest within Mali in terms of the military regime, right? There's the external interest. Is it worth supporting this regime, or is it worth working with other actors outside the regime who might in the long term create an opening for the kinds of reforms, right? Or they're actors within the institutions, right? So it's really much about looking kind of both within the security forces and within the broader political context. And just as Christine said, kind of doing that, looking at other kinds of institutions and dynamics. So those opportunities occur in post-war contexts. They occur in non-post-war contexts, even in the absence of a change in power, there might be sort of more limited kinds of openings where there is an interest in making some changes, and that's kind of where you can start. But it doesn't make any sense to come in and say, hey, we're going to do a big institutional overhaul when that sort of opening is not there. So just a few thoughts, but it's what's underlying the post-war transition, and that's important.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. So maybe to conclude this, I'm wondering what Liberia could be put forward, I think, as a case study of intervention in the immediate post-war, but also, because of the sustained nature of international support, as a kind of example of what Owen put on the table. Are there any points you would add from your own experience when you were in charge back in the day?
Owen, thank you very much. Yes, I think Liberia is a good example of, shall I say, a successful conclusion of a peacekeeping mission. The question and the difficulties then lies with how do you ensure that there is no mandate reversal on the successes that have been achieved over time. And therefore, it is so important that our development colleagues are brought into the same domain of delivery at the earliest possible time. So at the point of exit, there should be a smooth as possible change. The UN country team does not deliver solutions the same way that a peacekeeping mission does. But there is a lot of similarities and a lot of focus on the same principles. So if we work together at an early stage, there could be a way to build the transition in such a way that the country team is enabled to take the agenda forward. You know, the World Bank tells us it takes 40 years to build institutions. It should not be in our minds that when the UN peacekeeping mission has delivered its bit on SSR, that SSR is done. No, it will take decades for this process to continue. And therefore, we need to keep the thumb on the pulse. I do think that in the case of Liberia, we had an excellent relationship with the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund, and they strengthened the resident coordinator's office for an extended period of time to make this transition a little bit better and a little bit easier. So I think investment in that transition well in advance, not on the day of transition, is where a good solution can lie. But it's definitely a long-term approach that needs to be followed. It needs to be linked to the whole development agenda. And well, in the end, the question is, what happened when we left? And if things didn't significantly improve from that point going onward, one should ask why.
Thanks. I was going to joke that I now understand better that some of your gray hairs come from knocking some heads together in the UN system, but I'm glad to hear you had more positive experiences than that. So thanks for sharing those insights. That's really appreciated, you know, from the coalface. Excellent. Well, I hope that gave a bit of you know, some directions of answer in any case. You know, before we flip to Olivia, so hold your horses, please, for 1 second. The elusive point on political economy, right? Just very quickly, I'm looking for some pointers from Alex and Christine in particular, given your work for the stabilization unit. It's necessary, it's essential, but how should it be done and what's enough, right? I'm always mindful of some of the stuff that I've seen on Yemen political economy analysis that, you know, went in amazing detail on sort of business networks that existed and their collusion with politicians, security forces, etc. Amazing work by Chatham House. And then, you know, what is the FCO or former DFID going to do with it? You know, do they have even the capacity to engage with that level of detail? And I think we can ask the same questions for, you know, the Dutch Foreign Ministry or the UN mission. So if you could put on the table a few very quick sort of thoughts on, you know, if political economy analysis needs to be ingrained in the intervention or the operation, what does that look like? And what are the capabilities that you need to act on what you might find, right? But because it's nice to draw these maps about relations and where people come from and whether their wives are, you know, go back to the tribal village or wherever, you know, the kind of connections you might put your finger on. But how do you actually do it? How do you actually use that information? Could I turn to you, Alex, for a few quick thoughts, maybe from some of your casework or interviews? I'm putting you a bit on the spot, forgive me for that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I think that's right. So the first thing is I think it starts with a different way of thinking about the issue, right? So thinking about political economy analysis, right? I think if you're thinking about, well, you do the analysis over here and then you do the programming over here and somehow one has to inform the other in, you know, maybe a workshop or something, right? I think that's going about it maybe not quite the right way, in that the programming itself is about politics, right? What you're doing in SSR is in large part about dealing with the kind of a set of institutions that is political at its core, right? So the question of, well, let's do some programming and then integrate politics later, I think is not the wrong way. It's sort of in the programming fit. What are we doing? How is this programming addressing or working within this political environment is sort of one of the first questions I think that you need to ask. In order to do that, you need some basic, you know, at least some information about what what politics looks like, who's in power, where, you know, how they fit in, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly detailed, but I think the first step is having that as an input into the planning process, right? It's not something that comes later. Sort of once you've got your program, then you start doing a PEA to, you know, infuse it. It's part of the design process, right? the second thing is that it doesn't necessarily have to be an in-depth study. I think an in-depth study is good just to kind of have people's awareness of what's the kind of context you're dealing. I mean, when you go to a country, you should know something about that country, right? Part of what you should know is not just about, what are the laws and what the institute, what the police does and, what the different, units are. It's also who's, what's the political party, who's the president, what party is the president from, and, who's the head of the chief of police and who's the minister of justice, and, how do those people fit together? That's just, on the same par as, what are these different units and what do they do, right? So that's kind of basic information. But then the question is, then how do you kind of go about doing your work in a way that it recognizes that? And it, again, a lot of it is just about navigating relationships, right? I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of politics is about navigating relationships, right? Those relationships are have certain aims and ends, but it's about navigating certain kinds of relationships and building relationships in a way that's going to empower certain groups and maybe not other groups that aren't empowered, right? If you think about how within the UN, within the Dutch MFA, right, you're dealing with politics all the time, with bureaucratic politics in terms of getting resources for your programs. It's that people in partner countries are kind of thinking in the same way, right? And so the question is then, how are you using your resources to navigate those relationships? So I wanted to, building on something that Wally just said about Liberia and kind of, managing a transition, I think one of the best ways to do that is making sure you have good relationships and supporters in the institutions that you're working with. I really like the example in Sierra Leone, for example, when they were building the police, one of the things they did was kind of, handpick a few people that they thought were promising leaders, promote them, and create this kind of working group where those people were then those Sierra Leonean police officers were kind of in charge of the reforms, right? That's what you want. You want a kind of group of people who's politically capable and able to move things forward. And you want to develop the institutional relationships where that, you're going to kind of be working with those people over time, right? That's, and that those people have the kind of the wherewithal to navigate internally, right? That is also part of politics, right? So I think, to maybe sort of summarize, it's about kind of integrating the knowledge of politics into the planning process, but also working in such a way on kind of a day-to-day basis in programming that what you're doing is supporting the political process that's part of SSR, and that means different things in different places. But it's about kind of doing programming in that way.
Thanks. That may be a good takeaway line for our MFA colleagues from different countries. So to replicate the internal bureaucratic politics to external program interventions, not a bad thought. Christine, would you like to add briefly to Alex?
I'd love to, because I was nodding along to so much of what Alex was saying. And to point to some of the work that we did previously, huge credit here to Jonathan and Pat, who were my co-authors on this work from SOAS, and just some of the thinking that went on with the stabilization unit, the UK stabilization unit, which is now being disbanded, sadly, and folded into FCDO. But when we were working on this stuff, we were really thinking about how do we implement? What does this look like? What's the framework, right? So if you have to do a back of the envelope thinking through this kind of a problem, what are you trying to do, essentially? And the way that we really thought about it was to say, hey, look, what is the distribution of power on the ground? Essentially coercion. Most of the time we were talking about coercion. And then does it align or does it not align with who has political and economic power? And if those things are not aligned, then you're going to end up with a problem at some point in the future. The more that they are misaligned. So you can imagine that we do some kind of a peace deal, for example, on paper, for example, in Afghanistan, and we give a lot of power to particular actors that actually don't have real power on the ground, right? So civil society is empowered in this scenario, as an example, and that just doesn't align with what we see militarily on the ground. And over time, one ends up just taking over the other, and your political deal just doesn't hold up. It becomes a deal on paper, but something very difficult, something very different ends up being the de facto way of ruling. So, you know, the ways in which we deal with that, I think, is to talk about honesty and trade-offs in a much more open and transparent way. And I'm not saying that this has to be done in public, but I do think it has to be done in private, at least, at a minimum, right? So, you know, those closed door conversations within Security Council, within DPKO, DPA, whoever it is, right? Like, this is all, I think these are all of a piece, especially within governments themselves. A lot of these conversations just weren't happening because people didn't want to acknowledge that trade-offs had to be made, or it was politically inconvenient or politically difficult to tell your minister that this just wasn't going to work out in the ways that they envisioned it would, and explaining to people what the, you know, a very different reality on the ground is just, it's just not always going to take, right? And so that forcing a kind of honesty into the system. And I think, you know, Wally was talking about that at the start too, and it's really hard to do that. And getting that political analysis right. I mean, Alex was talking about this, and sometimes we should absolutely know the surface stuff, right? But a lot of the time you're not going to know that the Minister of Justice and the warlord are cousins, or, you know, that so-and-so is the niece of so-and-so, or, you know, there are all of these interconnections that we as outsiders will just not be privy to. And part of that you discover along the way when you end up doing the wrong thing. And I hear lots and lots of anecdotal stories about how that happens, but it is to do the best that we can. And I don't think we do the best that we can because, as Alex points out, it ends up becoming the afterthought. And then you've already made these decisions, but then there are all of these unintended consequences that come out of not doing that political economy analysis earlier in the cycle. And you think, oh gosh, I really screwed that up by not realizing that there were these very important connections that I have, you know, in some way slighted somebody or messed up a relationship or caused additional tensions that didn't need to be there. And all of that makes for a more febrile environment in one way or another, right? So there are all of these kinds of unintended consequences of doing the reforms in the way that we do, or suggesting changes, or asking for big changes very, very quickly, and not really giving a chance to those who will, you know, the losers that Alex was talking about, the winners and the losers. If you don't give the people who are going to lose something out of the situation a way to slowly adjust to it, you're begging a confrontation to happen of some kind, and it could become very violent. And this is often how we get a return to war, right? When the change is too fast and just too much of a cliff edge. If you ease people out of it and you give them the sense that there are different pathways, there are new opportunities, you buy them out in other ways. And I don't necessarily mean even using money, right? But just there are new opportunities in the new dispensation where they can participate. If you create, especially if you minimize the winner takes all kind of situation, and I would say this is true not just of security sector reform, but actually in all areas of peace building, right? So remove the winner takes all dynamic and allow for more kinds of sharing so that it's not just one party getting everything, because then that really ups the stakes for things like elections. You get everything or you get nothing. And then the other thing is not just about managing the quote unquote losers, but also constraining the winners so that they can't retaliate against the quote unquote losers, right? So those two dynamics, if you deal with them both together, really help to think about that kind of new political order and what it might look like, and how to deal with the transition in a politically more palatable way.
If I could just add very quickly, sort of point, I think, so what Christine is talking about is absolutely right. And these things kind of keep coming up and they change over time, right? And so part of it is into, you know, having those kinds of conversations on a continual basis, right? So there's somebody who knows right? It's very difficult for outsiders to know all of this, right? When you get started. And you discover things along the way, right? If you ask questions. The questions that you need to ask, right? They're fairly basic, right? Who are the actors? What are their interests? What are they doing, right? And what are their resources and networks, right? Those are the questions you ask at the beginning, and you have to keep asking those questions, and you keep on getting better answers. And the question is, as you get that information, is there a way to use that information as you make decisions? and too often they're not, right? And so I think part of it is, right, we talk about feedback loops and things like that, right? What does that actually mean? It means that there's sort of a part of your programming is you've got a person who's like watching these things as part of your SSR program. And you're having those kinds of conversations on a continual basis, and that those then in turn infuse your conversations with the partner country, right? So that's what I think it means. It's PA is, yes, the initial analysis is essential, but it's the kind of continual integrating into programming is even more essential.
Great. I'm starting to get a feeling we might dedicate another virtual gathering to this topic. Thanks for those additions, Alex. So Olivia, thank you for your patience. I saw that you put several questions in the chat, but I think I'm going to ask you to put one of them, if you don't mind.
Hi there, can you hear us?
Indeed.
Perfect, yeah, so this is on behalf of Olivia, the Dutch DCAF sort of collaboration, interdepartmental collaboration training. We have 3 questions, and on the spot we'll decide on one. Mick, do you want to?
Well, in that case, I will reformulate my question. Hi, Erwin. We had 3 very, very good and concise introductions. Mr. Waldemar Vrey gave an introduction on the outcome of the recent UN report that was accepted. And my question actually is, and I will reformulate my question since your introduction was so clear. I just had the question, how was it accepted in New York, honestly? You referred to investing in senior leadership, and also another one, a one UN approach. Could you elaborate a little bit on what does it mean in the field, if you will? Thank you very much.
Well, I guess we should turn to some of our UN colleagues around the table, but maybe you want to put a few pointers down, Wally, and then see whether anyone vehemently agrees or disagrees with you.
Thank you very much. I think those are good questions. And I would like to see my UN serving colleagues actually responding to this. I will say that we have seen quite a number of the matters have been addressed in the SG's latest report to the Security Council. So there are there's reason for optimism there, and one can be very positive. And I do think that on the matter of one UN approach, that this is something that lies at the heart of the senior leadership in any event, regardless of just looking at SSR. The challenge is not so much to get that instilled as a concept, but how to translate that into action. I think this is where it becomes quite tricky. In many cases, it works well. In many cases, it doesn't work so well. We are back with the remark that Alex made about relationships. It's all about relationships, and it's so critically important that we have all of this together. So if I may just in 2 sentences, it is so important to understand that when you enter this fragile situation, that the participants at the national level do not have the same understanding of the concepts that you have in your mind. And if we don't have a dialogue in advance to make sure that there is at least a reasonable common understanding of what the heck we are talking about, then we are going to confuse people. Does the Minister of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Finance understand SSR in the same language? If they don't, there goes your national ownership. There goes your political will. So you have to spend time on dialogue at different levels. Sorry to change the point a little bit from the question, but I think this is important to note.
No, that's much appreciated. And in fact, it might be a good segue to bring Hélène also into the conversation, since if I'm not mistaken, we spoke in the process of doing the review. So maybe you could, apart from posing your question, obviously also share any reflections you might have on the report, assuming that you've given it a quick glance at some point.
Hi, Erwin, lovely to see you, and thanks to all the panelists also for their great thoughts and presentations. I think I'm probably what I wanted to sort of bring forward, perhaps in a question, comment, and then I think it'll work well with what has just come up, is that two things came out here very clearly: that things are being done too fast and that it takes 40 years to build institutions. And I wonder, often for me, when I looked at this headline of the political obstacles, I think the international community is often the one that sets the agenda. And, as Alex mentioned, the recipients of the support are often in a sort of a, this is the supply rather than the demand side. And I think the political obstacles for me are often about the lack of coordination among the international partners who have their separate agendas. And I found this very, very prominent in several missions. And I just think that possibly one of the reasons for this is also that the problem starts in New York when we're drafting the Security Council resolutions, is that they will include certain benchmarks that are often not quite, realistic. But I'd love to hear a little bit more from the panelists about these sort of the international agendas, because for me, quite frankly, we often come into scenarios where our national counterparts do not have the capacity, the knowledge to be able to form the agenda themselves. And I feel that sometimes we are very good at pushing the agenda, which often has ill-intended consequences. Thank you very much, Erwin, and lovely to see you, Wally, as well. Thank you.
It's our pleasure, Ellen. Thank you. I think with a view to the time, I wonder whether I might ask you, Wally, to reflect on that question, both from the Liberia experience, but also the particular recommendation in the report, I think, that is about how UN mandates, mission mandates, are actually informed, or the absence of how they are being informed by correct assessments of the local political economy and the state of the security architecture. And then I'll make 2 or 3 very short remarks, and we can finish on the dot for people who have other engagements to respect. Would that be all right, Wally? With my apologies to Alex and Christine, of course.
Thank you very much for that. And hello to you, Ellen. It's nice to see you on screen. Well, I'm afraid she's right. We have a problem in that the international agenda, we have to deliver certain objectives and certain timelines, and money is linked to that. And if we don't deliver, then, there are very difficult questions asked about delivery, and people are replaced and so forth and so forth. This is how things go. So then we find somebody inside the host government who's willing to accept our support. We help them conceive concepts and plans, and not necessarily considering the local context in which all of this needs to happen, not necessarily considering the political dynamics that we are facing, not considering the knowledge that exists within the government. And therefore, as soon as the hoo-ha about congratulating everybody on putting a concept on the ground, as soon as that happiness dissipates and it turns into implementation, you have a mess. Because then you see that what the national institutions really want was not what is written in that concept. And now all of a sudden we may say, well, the political will is not there, or the ownership is not there, and these type of things that can face us. The long and the short of all of this is we have to take more time to consider the local dynamics and to bring all of the local context into this process. We will save time over the longer term, and money, by the way, if we do that, rather than trying to find quick fixes so that we can move out and move on to the next problem. We have to make sure that the problem that we are facing is fixed over the medium to the longer term. Thank you, Erwin.
Yes, I think that was actually a really nice way to weave the different threads of our conversation together, because one of some of my personal takeaways, which I will share in order to conclude our events in the full appreciation that your takeaways might be quite different. is I think one, this global space that Christina started talking about at the beginning, how it's declining and how it might necessitate a sort of less normative, less transformative, and slightly more state-focused way of thinking about security organization, security architecture, even a different language. And then we move to sort of, the factors that influence the local space for security sector work around the issue of network cohesion that Alex brought up, and resource availability as two critical factors that influence what space is available. And then finally, sort of the challenge of improving UN missions as a global tool for local intervention, right? Where there are some serious issues around leadership, mandates, resources, to name just a few. And I get a sense from this conversation that a lot comes together or is connected through, the understanding of the context in both their global and local dimensions. So is there a really good assessment of what the distribution of power, the relationships that come with it, the marginalization that often forms the flip side of that coin, and what they look like, and what limitations they impose, at least in the short term, that any concrete interventions simply need to treat as a given, right? And which may be more malleable in the medium to longer term, and what pathways for change that might evoke. So that brings us back not just to sort of the simple exhortation of sort of do more political economy analysis, which has been said for sort of over a decade now, and existing systems seem pretty resilient against that recommendation, but more something like think a little differently about how you go about designing and implementing what you're doing in terms of the factors that need to be taken into account and the questions that need to be asked. Before signatures are put on paper, platoons are sent somewhere, or experts are mobilized to be deployed within partner institutions. So maybe that's at least one point to take away. For the rest, I'm very grateful to your participation today, to this rich group of participants that we had. It's very nice to see a number of you again here online, and my particular thanks, of course, to Christine and Alex and Wally for your excellent contributions. So with that in mind, I think there is nothing else than to wish you a wonderful evening, and in the hope that we may meet again soon in some physical constellation. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And apologies for not answering all of the questions in the Q&A. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour, but I now have to run off and talk to my new MA students. So, and I think Erwin would have let this, if you guys want to, proceed with the conversation, feel free. It's just that I have to personally run. So thank you so much. And yes, it was a lovely and rich conversation. And let me throw out there two more things: social media and gender and in this space. And I hopefully at one point in the future, we can have another conversation about that, because I think those two dynamics will also change some of this discussion around SSR in the future. And I wanted to talk about that at one point, but we just didn't have the time to. So thank you so much, everybody. See you again at some future point. Bye.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thanks so much, Erwin, for organizing.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.